She extended her hand, and he looked at it the way you'd look at something unpleasant on the bottom of your shoe. That was the moment. That single, silent moment that would cost Harwick Capital Management $47 million, the trust of 11 institutional partners, and eventually, the career of a man who had spent 30 years convinced that the room always belonged to him. But we'll get to that. Her name was Josephine Adusei-Darko. She had driven 4 hours from Hamilton to Toronto on a Tuesday morning in February, which anyone who has done that drive in February will tell you is not a thing a person does casually. The 4:03 had been brutal. Black ice past Burlington. A transport truck jackknifed near Oakville that backed traffic up 45 minutes. She'd left before 5 in the morning to make sure she arrived on time. She arrived 7 minutes early. She was wearing the same charcoal blazer she'd worn to close the Meridian acquisition in 2019. She carried a portfolio binder that had seen better days. The spine was cracked. One of the elastic bands had been replaced with a rubber band from a bunch of broccoli because she'd never gotten around to buying a proper replacement. Inside that binder was a proposal for a co-investment partnership worth, conservatively, $47 million. Aggressively, closer to 60. She had done the math 17 times. The receptionist at Harwick Capital Management smiled at her when she came through the glass doors and told her Callaway would be right with her. She sat in the waiting area and looked out over Bay Street, 22 floors below, and thought about her father, who had come to Canada from Ghana in 1981 with $200 and a suitcase that had lost its wheels somewhere over the Atlantic. He used to say that the only currency that never devalued was preparation. She thought about that. She had been preparing for this meeting, in one form or another, for 11 years. Reginald Callaway kept her waiting 34 minutes. When he finally appeared, not the receptionist, but Callaway himself, walking through the frosted glass door with the unhurried confidence of a man who did not believe his time, and other people's time, were the same kind of thing, he stopped when he saw her. Just briefly. Just a flicker. But she caught it, because she had been catching that flicker her entire professional life, and she was very good at it by now. He recovered smoothly. He smiled. He walked toward her, with his hand extended. She stood and extended hers. And then something happened that she would describe later, to her business partner Cassandra, as the most expensive mistake I have ever personally witnessed. Callaway's hand dropped. Not all the way. Not rudely enough that anyone watching could have called it deliberate with absolute certainty. Just enough. His fingers brushed his jacket lapel, in a motion that could have been straightening his suit, except that it happened exactly as her hand reached forward, and his eyes had already moved past her to the receptionist's desk. And he said, "Josephine, is it? Thanks for making the trip. We're set up in the boardroom. My assistant will get you settled." And then he turned and walked back through the frosted glass door. She stood there for 2 seconds with her hand in the air. 2 seconds is a long time when your hand is in the air and the person who was supposed to shake it has already left the room. She lowered her hand. She straightened her blazer. She picked up her portfolio binder with the broccoli rubber band and followed his assistant down the hall. Here is what Reginald Callaway did not know about Josephine Adusei-Darko. He did not know that she had founded Arkfield Investment Partners in 2014 with $300,000 of personal capital, most of it borrowed against her house in Hamilton, and that Arkfield now managed a portfolio worth just under $400 million. He did not know that in the previous fiscal year, Arkfield had returned 23.4% to its investors, a number that put it in the top 6% of comparable funds in the country. He did not know that she had been profiled in the report on business, that she sat on the board of 2 Ontario pension funds, that she had been asked twice to speak at the Ivy Business School, and had declined both times because she did not enjoy public speaking, but was considering saying yes to the 3rd invitation, because her daughter thought it would be good for the business. He did not know any of this because he had not read the materials his junior associate, a young man named Terrence, who had actually done his homework, had prepared for him. He had glanced at the executive summary the night before, for 4 minutes between dinner and the hockey game. And what he had retained from that 4 minutes was Hamilton-based fund and co-investment proposal, and a name that was not familiar to him, which in his experience meant it was not important. Reginald Calloway was 61 years old. He had been in Bay Street finance for 32 years. He had survived the tech crash, the 2008 collapse, a hostile takeover attempt in 2014, 2 divorces, and a mild heart attack in 2020 that he described to people as a bit of cardiac drama. He ran Harwick Capital Management the way he had always run it, on instinct, on network, on the certainty that he could read a room in 30 seconds, and that 30-second read had never steered him wrong. He was wrong about that last part. He had just never been made to feel it. Until now. The boardroom at Harwick had floor-to-ceiling windows on 2 sides, and a table that sat 16. There were 8 people already seated when Josephine walked in. Calloway's partners, his senior analysts, a woman who turned out to be the firm's legal counsel. They stood when she entered, some of them, and the ones who didn't stand at least looked up. And there were handshakes, real ones, proper ones, and she noted who gave them and who didn't. Calloway sat at the head of the table. He gestured to a chair near the middle, not the one opposite him where a presenting partner would naturally sit, but the side, a subtle thing, a placement that said, "This is a listening meeting, not a negotiating meeting. We will hear what you have to say, and we will decide later." She sat where he indicated. She opened her portfolio binder, and she began. She spoke for 18 minutes. She walked them through Arkfield's track record, the specific sector focus, the infrastructure and energy transition assets she was looking to bring in co-investment partners for, the risk profile, the projected returns under 3 different market scenarios, the exit timeline. She was precise. She was not nervous. She had stopped being nervous in rooms like this sometime around 2017, and what had replaced the nervousness was something closer to clarity. When you have done the math 17 times, you are not nervous. You are certain. When she finished, there was a pause of the kind that follows a presentation that has landed. Terrence, the junior associate, had a legal pad in front of him and had been writing on it continuously. One of the senior partners, a woman named Jillian, leaned forward with her elbows on the table and asked 3 very sharp questions about the energy transition asset class. Questions that told Josephine she actually understood the sector. And the 2 of them went back and forth for several minutes, in a way that felt productive, the way a good meeting feels productive. Calloway, for most of this, said nothing. He sat at the head of the table with a pen in his hand and a legal pad in front of him on which he had written very little. And he looked at Josephine the way people sometimes look at someone they are trying to place. Not hostile, not interested, just distant. A kind of fundamental absence of engagement that was somehow more uncomfortable than hostility would have been. Near the end, as things were wrapping up, he leaned back in his chair and said, "It's a solid deck. I have to ask, who referred you to us?" It was the kind of question that sounds neutral and isn't. She told him the name of the contact, a mutual connection, a well-respected figure in the Ontario pension space whose name opened doors. Calloway nodded slowly, the nod of a man filing information. "Good," he said. "Good. And then, we'll be in touch." That was it. She gathered her materials. Several people at the table exchanged cards with her. Gillian shook her hand and said something quietly that sounded like, "I'll follow up separately," which Josephine noted. Terrence handed her a card and looked like he wanted to say something else, and then thought better of it in the presence of his employer. Calloway walked her to the door of the boardroom. Not to the elevator, not to the reception desk, to the boardroom door. And at the boardroom door, he did something that she would not be able to definitively call anything other than what it was. He offered his hand to the 2 men standing nearest to him, his partners, presumably, in a half-wave, half-goodbye gesture that included them. He did not look at her. She walked down the hall to the elevator. She pressed the button. She stood and watched the floor numbers descend. In the elevator, alone, she allowed herself to feel it fully. The small, cold, specific feeling she had been carrying since the moment in the reception area. She had been in this industry for 15 years and she knew what she knew. She knew the difference between a distracted man and a dismissive one. She knew what it felt like to be the person in the room that certain rooms were not designed for. She had spent years developing the discipline not to react to that feeling in the moment, because reaction in the moment cost you the room, and she had always needed the room. But she was 43 years old. She had returned 23.4% last year. She had driven 4 hours on black ice. She pressed lobby. She rode down 22 floors in silence. She sat in her car in the underground parking garage on Wellington Street for 11 minutes. She did not make any calls. She did not send any emails. She just sat, which was something she had learned to do. To give herself 11 minutes before making any decision that came from a place of feeling rather than thinking. After 11 minutes, she started the car. She did not make a decision in the parking garage. She drove back up the ramp into the gray February light, and she thought, as she always thought when she was processing something difficult, about what her father would say. Her father, who had come from Ghana with $200 and a suitcase without wheels, who had built a hardware business in Hamilton from nothing, who had told her once she was 19 and furious about something she can't even remember now. He had told her, "Do not waste your fire on the small fire. Save it for when it matters." She drove home. She did not call Harwick Capital Management to follow up. This was notable because the protocol in her industry was to follow up within 48 hours, a thank you note, a reiteration of key points, an expression of interest in next steps. She had a template for these follow-up emails. She had sent hundreds of them. She did not send one to Harwick. 3 weeks passed. Calloway's assistant emailed her on a Wednesday to say that Harwick had reviewed the proposal and was not pursuing the opportunity at this time, but wished her continued success with the fund. It was a form email. She could tell it was a form email because the comma after Josephine was in a slightly different font from the rest of the text, which meant someone had typed in her name after the template was written. She filed the email. She moved on. This is the part of the story where things get complicated, because what happened next was not something Josephine Adusei-Darko engineered. She did not set out to make Reginald Calloway pay for anything. She was a fund manager, not a person who spent her energy on outcomes she couldn't model. What she did was call Gillian. Gillian Marchetti had been a partner at Harwick for 9 years, and had, in that time, developed a well-deserved reputation as the sharpest mind in the room and a persistent inability to get Calloway to listen to what she was actually saying. She and Josephine met for coffee at a place on King Street, and the meeting that was scheduled for 45 minutes ran to 2 hours and 20 minutes. And by the end of it, Gillian had asked 3 questions about Arkfield's infrastructure assets that suggested she was not thinking about them as a Harwick partner, but as something else. They met again 2 weeks later. And then, 4 months after, Josephine had ridden the elevator down 22 floors on a gray February morning. Gillian Marchetti resigned from Harwick Capital Management and joined Arkfield Investment Partners as a senior partner, bringing with her 2 institutional client relationships that represented, between them, close to $90 million in assets under management. This was not revenge. This was business. But it was the beginning. What Josephine had not known when she walked into that boardroom was that Harwick had been quietly struggling. The firm's flagship fund had underperformed for 3 consecutive years. Not catastrophically, not visibly, not in a way that had yet made it into the press, but consistently enough that several of its larger institutional investors had been asking questions in private. Calloway's response to underperformance had always been the same: confidence, network, the suggestion that the strategy was sound and the market simply hadn't caught up yet. It was a response that worked when you had relationship capital to burn. He had been burning it for 3 years. When Gillian left, she did not make public statements. She was professional about it, as she was professional about everything. But in the small, specific world of Bay Street institutional finance, her departure from Harwick said something without saying anything. And in that world, which ran on signal more than statement, the signal was noted. 2 of Harwick's institutional investors, a pension fund manager named Douglas, and a family office that had been with Calloway since 2008, reached out to Gillian within 60 days of her joining Arkfield. Not to Josephine at first, to Gillian. But Gillian, when she met with them, talked about Arkfield the way she had been talking about it since that coffee on King Street. The track record, the sector thesis, the 23.4%, the founder. She talked about Josephine. Eventually, they asked to be introduced. Douglas and the family office representative, a quiet, meticulous man named Victor. Both came to Hamilton. Not the other way around. They came to Arkfield's offices, which were not on Bay Street, which were in a converted Victorian on James Street North that Josephine had bought when the neighborhood was still in transition, because she had grown up in Hamilton and believed in it. They sat in a boardroom that had original tin ceilings and one wall of exposed brick and a view of the escarpment, and Josephine walked them through the fund. No cracked portfolio binder this time. Her team had updated the materials. But the math was the same math she had done 17 times in February, and it was still good math. Douglas moved $42 million to Arkfield within the quarter. The family office committed $31 million. Harwick lost $73 million in assets under management in the span of 8 weeks. On top of the 3 years of underperformance. On top of Gillian's departure. This was now visible. It made the report on business, not a big story, a paragraph in the quarterly roundup of institutional fund movements. But in the world where that paragraph appeared, a paragraph was enough. The paragraph used the phrase, a period of significant outflows. 4 words. 4 words that meant, to everyone who read them, something specific and not good. Calloway called his remaining partners together. He was composed, as he always was composed, but there was something different in the room. The thing that had always kept Calloway's rooms in order was certainty. His certainty, projected outward, the absolute confidence of a man who had never had a reason not to be certain. And that certainty was still there, technically, formally, in the straightness of his posture and the steadiness of his voice. But it was doing something it had never had to do before. It was working. When confidence is natural, it doesn't work. It just is. When it starts working, the people who know you well can tell. His partners knew him well. A name came up in that meeting. Several names, actually. Departing clients, new strategies, possible pivots. But one name came up specifically. Arkfield Investment Partners. Harwick had declined to pursue the co-investment opportunity 8 months ago. Was there any possibility of revisiting? Calloway was quiet for a moment. I'll reach out, he said. He did not reach out. His assistant reached out, to Josephine's assistant. And the email was phrased in a way that treated the situation as a routine business inquiry, rather than what it was. Which was a firm that had turned down $47 million in February, and was now, in October, asking if there was any remaining room at the table. Josephine's assistant forwarded it to her. She read it twice. She set her phone face down on her desk. She looked out her office window at the escarpment, which was starting to turn. It was October. The ridge was going red and orange, and the particular yellow that southern Ontario produces in autumn that she had spent 43 years never getting entirely used to. She thought about her father. She thought about 11 minutes. She wrote back herself. Not through her assistant. She picked up her phone and she wrote directly to Calloway's assistant, and she asked to arrange a call with Reginald Calloway at his convenience. The call was scheduled. She and Calloway spoke for 22 minutes. He was warm in a way he had not been in February. A different energy entirely, the warmth of a man recalibrating. He spoke about partnership, about complementary strengths, about the opportunity he believed still existed in the co-investment space. He did not mention February. He did not acknowledge the email she had never sent, or the hand she had left extended, or the door of the boardroom he had walked her to instead of the elevator. She let him talk. When he finished, she said, I appreciate the call, Reginald. I'll be honest with you, we've committed that capital to other partnerships over the last 8 months. We don't have the capacity we had in February. There was a silence. I understand, he said. Is there any possibility of a smaller position? We're flexible on structure. She said she'd review what was available and be in touch. She was not sure, sitting at her desk in Hamilton, looking at the autumn escarpment, whether she would pursue anything with Harwick or not. That wasn't decided yet. What was decided, and had been decided since a parking garage on Wellington Street in February, was that whatever she did would be on her terms, in her time, at her convenience. Not because she was punishing anyone, but because that was simply the only way she had ever been interested in doing business. Calloway sent a follow-up email 2 days later. His assistant sent one the week after, then another. She responded when she was ready. The thing about Reginald Calloway, and about the particular kind of certainty he had carried for 32 years on Bay Street, was that it had never been tested by its own consequences. It had been tested by markets, by competition, by the ordinary pressures of the business. But it had never had to sit with the specific weight of a decision it had made in 30 seconds in a reception area. Without thinking, without reading the briefing note, without looking at the hand that was extended, he had to sit with it now. Not because anyone made him. Not because Josephine called him out, or made a statement, or posted anything, or told anyone what had happened in that reception area. She had not done any of those things, and would not do them. That was not how she operated, and it was not how her father had taught her to operate. But the weight was there. She knew it was there because she could hear it in the 22 minutes of that phone call. The careful warmth, the flexibility, the willingness to be on her schedule for the first time. 32 years of never being on anyone else's schedule. And here he was, asking to be fit in. He had read her materials by now. She was sure of it. He had probably read the report on business profile. He had probably read Arkfield's last 3 annual summaries. He was probably, in quiet moments in his office on the 22nd floor, doing the math she had already done 17 times. The math was still good. Whether Harwick Capital Management was still good. Whether the firm could right itself. Whether Calloway could do what Gillian had done. And simply be honest about what had happened and what needed to change. That was not something she could model. That was his problem. And the problem of the partners who had sat at that table and watched him walk her to the boardroom door and not to the elevator. The ones who had known what they were watching and had said nothing. Those partners were having conversations now, she suspected. The kind of conversations that happen after a paragraph in the report on business says significant outflows. The kind of conversations where people start counting. She could not tell you that she felt nothing about any of this. That would be dishonest. There was something, not satisfaction exactly, or not only that, but something more complicated. A feeling adjacent to vindication that also carried a kind of tiredness in it, the tiredness of having been right about something you wish you had been wrong about. She had wanted Harwick to be a good partner. She had driven 4 hours on black ice for that meeting. She had done the math 17 times, but she was also 43 years old, and she had learned over 15 years that the market had its own memory, longer and less forgiving than any individual's, and that eventually everything got priced in. The hand she had extended in that reception area. The 34 minutes she had waited. The chair at the side of the table rather than the head. The boardroom door instead of the elevator. All of it priced in. She responded to Calloway's last email on a Thursday afternoon in November, 2 weeks after she'd received it. She wrote that Arkfield's co-investment capacity for the current fiscal year was fully committed, but that she would keep Harwick in mind for future cycles. She wished him continued success with the fund. She used his own form language. She did not think he would notice. But she thought her father would have appreciated it, and so she included it. And then she pressed send. And then she picked up her phone and called Cassandra and said, "Let's go get dinner. I'll tell you about it." And Cassandra said, "I'll drive." And Josephine said, "No, I'll drive. I like the highway."